Please take your seats. The show is about to begin.
Welcome aboard.
Hello, everyone. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, thank you. Let's all take our seats because we have an awesome program kicking off this afternoon. I am Ben Gieman, energy reporter at Axios. Thank you for coming to our event on climate optimism in energy's uncertain future. I am also one half of the Axios Generate newsletter, so please make sure you subscribe. If you haven't already, you can subscribe to Axios newsletters at axios.com/newsletters. And for anyone following along on social media this afternoon, please make sure to use the hashtag Axios House. We've got a stacked lineup for the rest of the day and for tomorrow. Our first guest this afternoon is an expert in the energy industry and a former Obama energy advisor. Please welcome the founding director of the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, Professor Jason Bordoff. All right, so let's kick this right off. Biggest piece of advice for the incoming president?
Well, it might depend a little on who it is.
What?
But in some ways, I guess one point to make is there are ways in which it shouldn't matter who it is. One thing that both political parties hopefully should agree on, not only that climate is an urgent crisis, maybe they do, maybe they don't, but there are serious concerns with how this energy transition, which is picking up speed, plays out in terms of U.S. national security and economic competitiveness. And I do think that's something we should be able to find some degree of common ground on. And so that means providing certainty to investors domestically, that the stability of support from the IRA will be there. It means making it easier to deploy capital with that support. So we need to make it a lot easier to build infrastructure in this country with permitting reform measures. We need guidance to come out more quickly from the government to give companies some certainty about the availability of those tax credits. And we are now looking at the energy transition through the lens of great power competition.
Yeah.
And tensions, rising tensions between particularly the US and China. And we know that whether it's solar panels or EVs or critical minerals or batteries, China has a dominant market share in a lot of these sectors. Building the capacity to do more of that at home and diversifying those supply chains is in the US national security interest. It's in our economic competitiveness interest. It's also what we need to do to accelerate the energy transition. And related to that domestically is grid modernization. And that was important for the energy transition before, because we're trying to scale renewables, which are intermittent, into the grid so quickly. It's taken on a new urgency now with the revolutionary technology of artificial intelligence. And we lost muscle memory with how to meet growing electricity demand in this country. It hasn't grown for 20 years. And now the projected growth rates are 2x, 3x what we thought. And we know we're in a race with China for leadership in emerging AI technology. These investments in meeting the electricity demands for data centers and AI are existential for the big tech companies. They will find a way to do it. If it's not in the US, it'll be somewhere else. And we should make it as easy as possible to build energy infrastructure here in the US. And we should recognize the need not just for a lot more renewables, which we need, but clean, firm power as well. That means nuclear, it means advanced geothermal. And the fact that 45 years after the 3 Mile Island disaster, a big tech company is reopening that power plant is a sense of how urgent this need is. I was just in Japan last week. They have a lot of nuclear power plants that can be turned back on. This country doesn't have that, so we're going to have to find ways to build that capacity additionally. And I think whether it's reform of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission or permitting reform or a host of other things that make it easier to build infrastructure. And the last thing I'll say, I'm going to go on too long, we have little time, is it is in our competitiveness and security interest to help accelerate the deployment of clean energy around the rest of the world. The IRA was historic for investment in the transition for what is 12% of the world's emissions, the US economy. Meeting the climate challenge means accelerating clean energy so much faster in the rest of the world. But that's not just a matter of altruism. It is actually the case, in my view, that if we're able to partner with countries, diversify supply chains, show emerging and developing economies that there are economic opportunities and benefits and export opportunities for US companies, that is actually a good thing from a competitiveness and security standpoint. And I hope we could find maybe some cooperation and agreement across the aisle on some of those things.
Thank you. So one thing I'm pretty curious about is the role of large incumbent energy companies in this transition, especially the large oil and gas companies. A year ago, you wrote about the oil industry. You said, you wrote in the New York Times, quote, "Contrary to their rhetoric, the behavior of these companies suggests that they believe a low carbon transition will not occur or won't be as profitable if it does." A year later, how is the oil and gas industry doing on climate change?
Well, I think what I wrote in the New York Times a year ago is as true or more so today. I think we've seen at least, and it's hard to paint with a broad brush, different companies are in a different place. It's important to have that caveat. But if you're going to paint with a broad brush, which is what we have 15 minutes to do, we have seen some companies that were leaning into the energy transition sort of publicly announce a slowdown or a pullback for the pace of investment in clean energy. And that's unfortunate because there's a lot of capital budgets, engineering expertise, project management skills to help advance those technologies that some of those companies have. And it is appropriate to have societal expectations that they lead, that they do more, that they're out ahead. It is also the case that there's only so far out ahead you can be. I mean, part of the reason companies are doing that is because they're not making money in some areas of investment in clean energy, like offshore wind or some other things. In some cases, they were penalized by shareholders for being too far out ahead. And so they're trying to send signals to the market that they perceive will get their share price up. And so that's why, in addition to social pressure, we need market pressure, right? We need to make it, if the best thing for companies to put more capital and move faster in clean energy is to see that there are strong economic returns and the market rewards them for doing that, doesn't penalize them. And that's why we need the whole system to change. We need to deploy clean energy faster. We need oil demand to start falling rather than continuing to rise every year, which is what it's doing today, along with gas and along with coal. They're all rising year after year for all the talk of the transition. And if that's the reality of the world we are in, it's understandable why investors are going to reward companies that continue to produce that energy. And of course, we're going to need that energy for decades to come. This is a multi-decade transition. But accelerate. It comes back to what I talked about before. How do we both accelerate the pace of investment in clean energy domestically and deploy a lot of tools of investment support? Reauthorization of the Development Finance Corporation is coming up. How do we de-risk investment in emerging and developing economies so that demand starts to fall for hydrocarbons and people see that in the long term there's going to be more economic rewards from investing in clean energy? So we need to both push companies to do more and create an environment in which over time it is increasingly in their economic interest to make that shift.
You know, one forum where these discussions always play out, and certainly we're going to see in kind of less than 2 months now, is at COP29. And so, you know, I know that you've expressed concern in the past that the integration of climate action and foreign policy is really too rare at these UN summits and elsewhere. So, you know, as we approach almost 10 years after the Paris Agreement was struck, is the COP system still kind of fit for purpose? And if it's not, what are some of the biggest changes that would be needed in that process?
Yeah, look, the UN negotiating process, roughly 30 years old, is incredibly important. We know we need cooperation across countries to make faster progress on climate change. But the world is changing. It is also a world now where competition can be as powerful a driving force as cooperation, and that is what a big motivator of the Inflation Reduction Act, a big motivator of China's industrial strategy over decades, was competition and leadership in emerging technologies. One thing that we've built at the Center on Global Energy Policy, and maybe just my own background at the National Security Council, is trying to build a home for expertise in energy, in the energy transition and climate change, with expertise in international economics, trade, sanctions, foreign policy. And I think everyone recognizes now you can't have an energy transition if you don't navigate these things, right? There is a tension between trying to push back on the dominance that China has in clean energy sectors and the cost of clean energy, right? A lot of stuff is cheap there. If you put tariffs on it, it makes it more expensive. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be concerned with 90% dominance, but we need to grapple with those tensions. And so it's frustrated me as you sometimes, you know, I go to climate conferences like here or at COP, and then you're at the Munich Security Conference or somewhere else, and these are separate communities. They can't be. If we're going to have a successful transition, we need to bring those communities together. I think we have to continue to invest in the UNFCCC process, but I don't think it should be the sole focus of, say, U.S. international climate engagement. We also need leadership in administration to coordinate all the tools of development finance, international economics, trade, because there are so many other ways in which the U.S., I mentioned the Development Finance Corporation before as one example of that. You know, it's important that I think in a very senior way in the White House, they are coordinating not just domestic climate action, but coordinating all the tools of the federal government to really help to accelerate the pace of clean energy through the lens of national security, foreign policy, economic competitiveness, as well as the cooperation we need for the UNFCCC.
You know, one topic that sits kind of smack dab at the intersection or the crossroads of these questions around geopolitics and climate policy is the pause on new LNG export permits to major markets. I mean, I know exports are going to grow no matter what, given what's already sort of been approved, but given the kind of geopolitical leverage that LNG does provide the U.S., should the U.S. resume approving these export licenses to major markets?
You know, the federal law requires that before giving a permit to export LNG, the federal government make a finding that it's not contrary to the national interest. That's what federal law requires. You have to find it's in the national interest to approve that incremental permit. And so what is the national interest? You'd want to look at the concerns that our allies have. When I worked for President Obama, we were hearing all the time from Eastern European leaders and the Prime Minister of Japan who were showing up and saying, can we get access to U.S. LNG? It's important for our energy security. I was in Japan last week. There's a lot of concern about the pause because they are concerned about their energy security and where they're going to get their energy from. Climate impacts, and whether this is substituting for coal or renewables, whether methane emissions are being controlled, environmental impacts are also part of a national interest determination. What impact does increasing export volumes have on the domestic price of energy? Might be another concern. And we've gone from 0 to 13 or 14 BCF a day of capacity today. We're going to double that. Whether this pause stays in place or not, we're already doubling that. And there's even a question about how big an impact the pause has because, like, everyone's projecting potentially an abundance of LNG by 2030. How many additional projects, even if they Even if the government said anyone can have a permit who wants one, how many additional projects are going to happen anyway? So I think it's appropriate for the administration to say, let's make sure that the evidence we have by which we're making those decisions is up to date, and that's what they're doing. And once we have that information, kind of decide whether to move forward with additional permits or not.
Thank you. I have kind of a climate relevant oil question for you, which is that lately or for maybe even a couple of years, we've been seeing some pretty stark divergence in the at least near to midterm oil demand estimates from OPEC versus the International Energy Agency. And I'm kind of wondering, given that we're starting to see this wide variance, is this a problem for energy transition policymaking? And if so, or is this a healthy thing that we've got a lot of different thoughts kind of bouncing around the kind of investor and policymaking sphere?
The variance in projections for oil demand growth.
That's right.
Yeah,
Future demand.
There's always some uncertainty. It's just a reflection of the world we're in now. We're in a different world, a highly uncertain time. In the past, whether you're an investor, a private equity firm, a large bank, or an oil company, you kind of knew that in the long term, oil demand was going up, not down. And maybe it's going to be 1%, 2%. There would be brief periods of economic downturn. Maybe it would be flat or fall or a pandemic, and then it would grow again. But there was no question in the long term it was going to be higher, and you wanted to invest accordingly. That's genuinely uncertain now. We don't exactly know when it's going to peak, and is it going to plateau? Is it going to fall sharply, or is it going to keep growing? Because the demand from emerging and developing economies is so strong, and they need energy for economic growth. So I think that is just a period of greater uncertainty, greater volatility, and it presents risks, right? I mean, it presents the potential risk even of underinvestment. That if oil demand keeps growing and you're not investing, the consequence of that is price spikes, and then you cede market control or even influence the power, say, of countries that hold spare capacity to mitigate price volatility, because no politician wants oil price spikes. So when you pick up the phone and call Riyadh and say, can you please put more oil on the market quickly to bring gasoline prices down, because it's hurting the economy and our political re-election chances, that influence could be greater before, in the long run, it is certainly smaller. And so I think as interesting as the question of everyone asks, when will oil demand peak? It's almost more interesting to ask, when will we know that it did peak? Because we thought coal use peaked in 2014, and last year was the highest year ever. We thought U.S. gasoline use peaked in 2008. You can see headlines. And then, so if you see a year or two of flat demand, or even gradual decline, and everyone's like, peak demand is here, and then you pull back from investment, and then it turns out like something causes it to spike again, we might actually need to think about more tools, which could include government tools, to think about mitigating volatility in what is going to be a deeply uncertain, multi-decade, volatile period of transition. Because if there is volatility, if there are price spikes, if people are concerned about the affordability and reliability of energy supply in the process of this transition, I fear support for stronger transition policy could wane, right? As soon as the first thing that happens as soon as people see their prices, their bills go up, is they say, well,
very little tolerance,
populist backlash against climate action. So that would help accelerate the transition.
That is a lot of food for thought. Unfortunately, we're starting to run out of time. So speaking of food, you're a lifelong New Yorker.
Yes, welcome to my hometown.
Yes. For folks that are either in from out of town or just looking for recommendations, as people are here for Climate Week, best place to get a bagel, best place to get a slice of pizza?
So that's the wrong question. So the best, I think it's hard to say the best. One of the best bagels is one block from my house, Absolute Bagel up near Columbia. I say pizza because, so it was my birthday like 2 or 3 weeks ago, and my wife and kids said, where do you want to go for dinner? The next day, my parents, and the next day, some of my great colleagues in the Energy Center. And my answers were Shorty Tang's cold noodles with sesame sauce at Hua Wan in Chinatown. The next day, we went to Katz's Deli, and then the next day, Liebman's Deli in the Bronx. So those are my recommendations.
Sounds like a delicious tour. Jason Bordoff, unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
So, if folks could please stick around for a quick word from our sponsor, and then an exciting guest with my Axios Generate colleague, Andrew Friedman. Thanks so much.
Good afternoon. I'm Nicholas Johnston. I'm the publisher of Axios. Thank you so much for joining us here. This is our very first Axios House at Climate Week. We've got 3 or 4 days of tremendous programming here. We're in the thick of it. So thank you all so much for joining us. We're always very, very grateful to our partners who make everything we do at Axios possible. The investments we make in our journalism, events like this, that's all thanks to our partners. So a huge, huge thanks to GE Vernova for making this conversation happen today. So I'm very excited to welcome for a view from the top conversation GE Vernova CEO Scott Strazik. Scott, welcome to the Axios stage.
Thanks for having me.
Great to see you again. Big picture. We're talking optimism here today. Sometimes the climate transition gets a bad rap. Grid failures, extreme weather. Tell us your sense of optimism. What underlies that?
Well, I think growth creates a lot of opportunity for us when you think about that, and the innovation and the ability for an ecosystem to really challenge itself to work differently on a go-forward basis. I've been in the industry for over a decade, and when I think about where we sit in Cambridge, Mass. at our corporate headquarters today, you don't have to go far in that neighborhood to see a lot of innovation that's happening, whether on the MIT campus, whether it be places like Greentown Labs. I see some folks from there here. The engine with incredible opportunities to have an impact on the world, but that needs to figure out how to do it at scale and industrialize that at impact. And I think a lot of those forces are starting to come together in a different way because they have to, because of the realization of the challenges the world has.
You guys folks literally put on your website, I think, the two places where how you view these coming together. It's decarbonization and electrification. And
yeah.
I think we're at the start of that. Tell us how those two things work together.
You bet.
In your mind.
And you know, we are very intentional to start with electrification in a sense, because it'd be very easy to just turn the lights off, but that's not going to help the world. We need to figure out how to continue to create more supply of electricity while decarbonizing it quickly. So, you know, take our gas business as an example. We do power about half of the install base in the world for gas. Do we turn it off, or do we figure out how to decarbonize it? And that's why we're investing so much money today in hydrogen combustion. That's why we're spending so much money today on carbon capture, because the reality is we need to further electrifying the world while figuring out a way to decarbonize it. And with the demand that we see for the world today, it's going to be more about how do we add to what already exists while we clean up a lot of what's already there if we have any chance at meeting both goals.
It's almost like two sides of the same coin. Like the need to electrify, the need for more electricity can be hand in hand with the decarbonization if that's what the new technologies are bringing to the grid.
No question. I was having breakfast with a customer this morning, and you know, he's been a leader in the industry for 35 years, and he mentioned it's the first time that as he's working on projects, it's actually additive to the system versus someone being a net loser with every project he would get done. Because for him today, he's doing a ton of wind and solar, but in parallel, it doesn't mean something that's already on the grid needs to come off. It means what's already on the grid needs to become less carbon intense every day. And if we can do both of those things together, continue to add more and more zero carbon power while reducing the carbon intensity of what we've got, we can make a lot of progress quickly.
There's a word you've used when we've talked before about this, where we're at the start of a super cycle. Tell us what you mean by that.
Yeah, I mean, in my lifetime, when you think about real investment super cycles, think about globalization in the 80s and 90s. Think about software and the internet in the 2000s and the 2010s, and how much that sculpted a change in economies, a change in workforces, a change in really how we live. The reality is the amount of investment that's required to transform the electric power system is going to have very similar impacts on jobs, on economies, on winners and losers. And that's why it's so important right now that we continue to lean in with both innovation, but also different forms of partnerships to solve these big problems.
A key element of this is sustainability. I know you folks released your first sustainability report last week. Tell us how that fits into that, how you think about it as a CEO.
It does start, everything with us starts with sustainability, but we talked a little bit about the electrification and the decarb, but it's more than just that. For us, we also talk a lot about thrive. We need to operate in communities that those communities thrive because we're doing business in those places, and that's from the perspective of safety. That's from the perspective of diversity. And simultaneously, while we're making those investments in those communities, how do we conserve and get more and more efficient every day? So for us, it's more electricity every year with less carbon attached to that electricity in communities that feel like they're winners with operations that get more efficient every year. And if we can do that, we're pretty confident we can have a real impact on the world.
So I think we know where you are now. What's great about Climate Week is that this is a room filled with people who care and can move the needle on it. So how can they help? Give a call to action to these folks.
This is, we use a term inside the company a lot of a decade of action. I think it's important that we don't depend on some magic wand to solve this problem or to set grandiose long-term goals and a silver bullet to come in and fix this. We need to take advantage of this decade of action with what we have, with the technology that exists to accelerate it and to work together in different ways. And if we do that, we'll move the needle. And I mean, how do you eat an elephant? Bite by bite, piece by piece. And that's what we've got to do with this. And if we go about it with that mentality, we can make an incredible amount of progress.
I mean, a decade is a long time. Are there shorter term ways that you look at it? Are there shorter term things that people should think about more immediately on these things?
I think it's the same. I think it's the same analogy. I mean, the reality is the technology's there. We're making an incredible amount of progress. So how do we nurture an ecosystem that allows it to thrive? And we do that together as a business community, as government, as NGOs. It's there for the taking, and it doesn't take a decade. It's stuff that we can do now. The technology is accelerating quickly, and it's helped by the growth cycle that we're in to accelerate even faster tomorrow than it did yesterday. So I like our chances.
Yeah, so let's bring this full circle then. Put all this together and kind of give us a bottom line to take out of why you are so optimistic, how all these things come together to give you a sense of like in 10 years it'll be better than it is today.
I think it just goes back to what we've talked about. I mean, this has been a very flat demand environment for a while. It's harder to kind of create, to adjust or really impact the trajectory when a demand cycle is reasonably flat. We're in a clear upcycle of demand, and that, frankly, increases the burden of responsibility, but also opportunity for us as a system to fix this.
That's almost an irony in it, in that a rising demand for electricity actually creates the incentives and the ability to make those kinds of investments.
To me, it's one of the more contradictory things I feel like I've seen in the U.S. the last 6 months. People are almost scared of the growth. The growth is the only thing that's going to give us a chance to actually address this. So yes, electricity demand is going to go up, but that's creating the opportunity for us to restructure the entire system. So we don't want to be afraid of rising electricity demand. That's exactly what we need. And by the way, that electricity demand growing is net decarbonizing other parts of our economy that are generally dirtier. So this is forcing the electric power system at a scaled level to have an even bigger impact where we can, because the technologies exist. So this is there for the taking.
You've nailed it with a pretty good synopsis of how to be optimistic. So before we get the hook here, we're going to end on one fun thing. As we're looking 10 years into the future, when I go home back to DC and tell my kids what I've been doing all week, tell me something cool I can tell them about the energy transition. What's a cool piece of tech that's cooking that'll impress my 13-year-old daughter?
There's a lot of cool tech. I think it starts, I've got a 12-year-old son, a 10-year-old daughter.
How do you impress him?
Yeah. My son loves to ski. I start there, and I'm like, if we don't get this right, that skiing's going to change. And I mean it, right? So he's paying attention. But then once he's paying attention, there's a lot of neat things. We could go to our research center in upstate New York right now, and we'd see a direct air capture facility that's pulling carbon out of the air today. Right adjacent to that facility, we're pulling water out of the air, a system that we built for troops in remote parts of the world. We can do this with the technology. Now, industrializing it at scale, we've got some work to do.
I think that's the real question. There's all these ideas that are now here. The next 10 years are going to be getting them exactly to your point at scale.
But with growth, that's when you have a much better chance to actually industrialize things at scale, because then there's no excuses. When you're in a flat to down market, it's a lot harder to build a supply chain to solve that problem. In a growth market, the excuses are gone. So that's exactly why we're going to take it on.
Scott, thanks for being here. Huge thanks to GE Vernova for making this possible. We're going to get Andrew Friedman back up here for the big finish. Thanks.
Great. Thank you.
Hey, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Andrew Friedman, Senior Climate Reporter with Axios. another half of the Generate newsletter team. My next guest doesn't need much introduction. She's a leader in the U.S. energy sector. Please welcome Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm.
What is this walk-on music?
I know. It's not bad. So I'd like to start where I think a lot of energy geeks and climate folks' minds are at, which is data centers and AI. Last week brought the Microsoft and Constellation announcement regarding 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. What did this announcement signal to you about data center power needs and also the future of nuclear?
Both extremely positive, I'll say. I mean, data center power needs, we want these data centers to be built in the United States. We want them to make sure for AI purposes, for national security purposes, as well as for economic purposes, we want them to be located here. We know that it's going to require a huge amount of power demand. We also know that the hyperscalers are eager to bring their clean power with them. So, for example, this is why Microsoft did this deal. A lot of them are interested in small modular reactors. In fact, if you could cluster a number of them together, they could order a 12-pack, and that could take small modular reactors to scale. And that's the kind of thing, the conversation we're having. We know that there's been interest in enhanced geothermal. They all want clean baseload power. We know that there's been interested in renewables plus batteries. All of that is very positive. The expectation is that there will be 15% growth over the next few years in demand just from AI. Of course, we've got the demand pull from transportation, electrifying transportation, and all these factories that are coming online as well. But the good news is that we can do this. This year, in 2024, it is projected, these are based upon what developers have told us and that we are going to get on our grid, we will be adding 60 gigawatts of clean power on our grid this year. That's 30 Hoover dams worth of clean power on our electric grid this year. That's 19 Hoover dams worth just of solar, which is double what it was the year before. So there's a hockey stick happening right now as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law. It's become irresistible to develop these resources. So my point is that we know we can add clean power. We have modeled for this at the Department of Energy. And we know that nuclear is absolutely an important part of that clean power future. We just got to get some of these SMRs built.
And you see the demand. The demand is very near term, too. What steps are needed from your department or Congress or elsewhere in the government to make sure both our aging grid is capable of meeting the addition and load growth, as well as without turning to more carbon and methane intensive sources of fuel? You see a lot of utilities that are kind of signaling that they might want to build some gas plants.
Yeah, I mean, we can do this with clean. That's my point. 60 gigawatts is a huge amount of power in 1 year. I mean, we can do, and we're going to continue to see that trajectory at least for the life of the Inflation Reduction Act, and hopefully we get extensions. With respect to the aging grid, you're probably aware, because I know you guys have been covering it, but the amount of money that has been invested because of either the bipartisan infrastructure law or the Inflation Reduction Act on the grid is about $75 billion, $35 billion coming from the Department of Energy alone. But that's not going to be enough. I mean, we are very interested in, for example, the amount of power that can be added or that would be unleashed if we reconductored the grid and added more power, twice the power on the same infrastructure, or used grid enhancing technologies. We have a liftoff report that says that up to 90 gigawatts could be added just from those kinds of efforts where you don't have to get a whole bunch of new permitting, where you can get a categorical exclusion to be able to reconductor, et cetera. So we are continuing to do that. What needs to happen? I think there needs to be more of a sense in Congress that the grid is a piece of U.S. infrastructure like roads are, like the highway system is, and that we need to think about it, because every year, I mean, there are large pieces that need to be replaced. It is old. It is subject now to all these extreme weather events. So we need more investment on a regular basis, not just a one-off grant basis. So I think Congress should think about that going forward.
Is there anything about the grid itself that keeps you up at night?
Yeah, going out, for sure. I mean, I'm worried about cyber, right? I'm worried about nefarious actors on the grid. And I am worried about these extreme weather events, which continue to happen with such velocity, and that we aren't going to have enough. I worry about the wildfires. I worry about, every time New Orleans gets hit or Puerto Rico gets hit. So I just think we have to think about things in the context of extreme weather events and build in a way that recognizes that there will continue to be extreme weather events going forward, and not just continue to put wood poles and string wires across the top. We need to think about it in a much more resilient way. Yeah,
the wood poles with wires across the top is very much what's happened in my neighborhood in Southern Maryland. Yeah.
And it's ugly.
Yeah, it's ugly and not necessarily reliable. So your department, as well as others in the administration, is very busy in spending funds under the bipartisan infrastructure law as well as the IRA. The EPA Inspector General last week warned about the potential for fraud stemming from the sheer size and complexity of the GHG reduction fund. That may not necessarily be mostly under DOE, but how is DOE ensuring that its funds are allocated appropriately as it accelerates getting money out the door ahead of the election?
We, like everybody, want to prevent any waste, fraud, and abuse. We recognize the size of these programs is significant. The Department of Energy was given 60 new programs and 88 overall, if you count the expanded programs under the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. We have been working hand in hand with our Inspector General to make sure we design these programs in a way that protect the taxpayer and reduce any waste, fraud, and abuse. We are feeling really good about how we have organized this, and this is true. We set up a whole new process with respect to making sure that we don't have investment from countries that may not have our interests at heart in these grant opportunities. So we've been very vigilant about it. I know other agencies have as well. The president has been really clear about making sure that we all have a close relationship with all of our IGs that are attached to each of the departments. So we're doing everything possible to make sure that the money goes where it needs to go in an efficient way.
So before I turn back to renewables, let me touch LNG. A fossil fuel that the U.S., as you well know, is the biggest global exporter of right now. You're 9 or 10 months into this analysis of the climate impact of LNG balanced against other U.S. interests. What have you learned so far?
Well, no news here. We are going to have a report that is released for comment around the end of the year. There will be an ability for folks to weigh in. The labs who are working on this are finalizing their analysis, and I am not going to announce in advance what they're going to show, but just know that we've got really the best minds working on this.
Have you at least been briefed on the findings as they've gone along, or is this going to be a surprise to you as well?
I'm generally aware of what's going on.
Okay. Just between us, I mean. DOE is doing some interesting work that I read up on last night on deploying renewable energy projects at sites that are part of a very different legacy, that are a legacy of the building of the atomic bomb. Can you tell me a little bit about the potential that is there for these locations to be turned from their previous reputation to be part of the new clean energy economy and a totally different association that most people might have with them?
Yeah, what a great story this is. We've got so many of these sites that are from the Manhattan Project era, and that our environmental management office has been working for decades to clean up and make sure there's no radioactive waste or et cetera. But once that happens, they're still part of the federal government's ownership. And so what we've done is to say we are launching a program called Clean Up to Clean Energy. So, for example, at Hanford in Washington, there is a big nuclear cleanup site there, the largest. They have thousands of acres of land that would otherwise be available. So we are making it a very large solar site. We just announced five particular sites. Developers were selected for renewable energy across all of these properties. And it's one way that we are looking to create Phoenix projects where Phoenix rises from the ashes of property or facilities that were underused or not used anymore.
It's a good labeling of that. Branding. It's very good branding. I think in terms of technologies that DOE is working on, that you see out there, and then maybe talked about a lot at different of the 9,000 events that are happening this week here in New York. What are you particularly excited about in the clean tech space?
Well, my favorite, as my team will know, I love enhanced geothermal. I really think the potential there is so vast, hundreds of gigawatts, the heat beneath our feet, which could be extracted in a safe way where there is, very little impact. And so I'm excited about seeing those happen more rapidly from a permitting point of view, but also pairing them with these hyperscalers and others who would like to see it. So that's number one. I'm also extremely bullish on long-duration energy storage as well. And some of you are familiar with some of the companies that DOE has funded, but one I love to point out, because it's a Phoenix project as well, which is Form Energy. Form Energy is developing a 10-hour plus iron-air battery for utilities. And 10 hours is a lot, right? It can solve a lot of problems. But what this company did was decide to locate this utility-scale battery company, their first manufacturing facility, on the site of a closed down steel mill in Weirton, West Virginia. And that steel mill had employed thousands of people over its time. When it closed, the sidewalks rolled up in Weirton, and they felt hopeless, like so many other places across the country who saw manufacturing jobs leave. When Form was looking at it, they decided, well, why don't we take advantage of the incentives and build our factory on the site of this steel mill, where an iron-air battery on the site where they once forged steel, and the company now has started hiring, and they're operating. And they announced last week, as part of our Grid Resilience Innovation Program, that they have a contract with a utility in Maine to do the largest rollout of the utility scale batteries in the United States, of long duration energy storage in the United States. So I am super excited about anything that creates clean baseload power. And of course, long-duration energy storage creates quasi-baseload power out of renewables when paired with it.
Now, your department also is heavily involved with direct air capture, with carbon removal and CCS. How viable do you see these technologies as being right now, and big a role them playing in the near future?
Well, I do think that the incentives are really important, because they wouldn't be viable from a commercial point of view, I think, without that. But that is an important part of what you do when you scale new technologies, right? I think if we're going to get to net zero by 2050, carbon management solutions are a part of the equation. They just are. And the better they get because of scaling and investment in technology, the better off we'll all be in terms of addressing CO2 emissions. So I think that, we've funded a number of startup companies in this space, and there are a number of players that are taking the technologies to scale right now. And they are also going to be paired with some of the hydrogen hubs that are looking at blue hydrogen. So we're excited over the next couple of years to see how this, how this rolls out. And I'm very bullish on it.
Trying to ask this in a very particular way. You seem to love your job. Probably, I'd rank you probably the most of the cabinet, really.
I do have the best job in the entire administration, if you can imagine. I mean, it's...
if given the chance to serve in this role or in government again, would you strongly consider it?
Of course, I'm open to whatever, but those are conversations I would have to have, and it would have to probably be with whoever wins the election.
Probably with them. Yeah, it would probably be with them.
And let's be clear, there's only one person that I'd serve with. Anyway.
Yep. Yeah. See, that's how I didn't phrase that question, because I didn't know if you'd go there. We like to close with one fun thing. I remember you from this program. People here may not be at the forefront of their minds, but what is one thing that you learned from your time as a TV host of the War Room at Current TV that has stuck with you and maybe helped you deal with people like me?
Okay, first of all, let me ask, did anyone even know or hear of a program called The War Room? Okay, you are such a nerd.
I know, I am.
You would even know this.
I watch your advisory board meetings for like 4 hours. Yeah, my wife makes fun of me for it.
I am so sorry to hear that. Well, I don't know what to say about that other than at that point, Al Gore was my boss. And he, who had funded this effort to do a whole network, he was really, really funny as a guest. And so bringing your boss on to get him to tell jokes was really the best part of being a host for that brief moment that I was on Current TV.
Well, thank you very much. We had Gore here earlier. I think he illustrated some of that humor that he displayed when he was with you. And thank you for coming to Axios.
Oh my goodness, of course. Thanks so much. Thanks, everybody.
So apparently the next host is me. Our final guest this morning, a top voice in the climate finance landscape. I want you to welcome to the stage the Rockefeller Foundation President, Dr. Rajiv Shah. We didn't get to meet backstage because I was told to turn around. But first, congratulations on the Mission 300 announcement late last week. Can you tell folks what you're trying to do with that and why this is so significant?
Yeah, well, first, it's great to be with you. It's great to be here. It's great to follow the secretary and to hear about Al Gore's sense of humor, which is fun, always fun. I'm excited because we have now engaged in this large-scale partnership with the World Bank and the African Development Bank, a group of philanthropies, and most importantly, green energy infrastructure developers across Africa to reach 300 million people with renewable electrification by 2030. And from my perspective, it's the largest public-private partnership for Africa today. It fundamentally requires more than doubling the pace of electrification to reach people who don't have enough electricity to really benefit from a modern digital economy, and to do it with green infrastructure versus fossil fuels. And it is the largest single commitment of resources from multilateral banks to a single project topic, in this case, green electrification, and $30 billion of committed resources, certainly than I've ever had the opportunity to work with on this kind of an effort. So to me, in a world where most of these countries, more than 40 countries, are spending more in debt service obligations externally than they are on health and education domestically, when they're asked to invest in green greening their economy, there's no money to do so. People are rioting in the streets in Nairobi and Lagos as it relates to fossil fuel subsidy reductions. And their economies are so constrained by the high cost of diesel backup generators, which is what powers most small businesses, that there are no jobs to be had for the youngest population on the planet. This is a tremendous breakthrough for climate and for development.
In 2023, Rockefeller Foundation, which you lead, announced a 5-year plan to put over $1 billion to work on climate change and to work towards the goal of net zero emissions operationally. Where are you on that 5-year journey, and specifically on that organizational net zero goal as well?
Yeah, well, so this was a journey for us to get there because, as is not going to be surprising to many of you, the Rockefeller Foundation was, of course, founded on the Standard Oil fortune, the original big fossil fuel fortune. And the institution for over 115 years has been active on a global basis, but has never made commitments around climate at this scale. So we committed to managing our endowment towards a net zero target by 2050. We committed to being net zero by 2050 in our operations, and we committed to expending in the next 5-year window $1 billion of programmatic resources fighting climate change. And on all three, we're making great progress. On the endowment piece, we've pulled together a group of investors and asset managers from across the United States and across the world, but also from parts of the U.S. political economy that are not so forward-leaning on climate. And together we're charting a path forward to how to measure the carbon impact of investments and which indicators to use and how to chart a responsible path towards that. A couple of years ago, we divested of fossil fuel assets across our endowment. On the operational pledge, we have started to track our own carbon footprint. As a foundation, we're a global foundation with several hundred team members around the world, but we fit into the category of medium-sized global consulting firm for the operational pledge. That's a very hard category to decarbonize. So we're on our way. At some point, it'll require the purchase of carbon credits to offset things like travel and everything else, but we feel it's important to walk the talk. And in terms of our program commitments across health, food, energy, and finance, we've made big shifts into the kinds of partnerships I just mentioned. We're putting an initial $10 million into the technical assistance support for this large-scale $30 billion effort to bring green infrastructure to developing economies in Africa. And there are many other examples of engagements in that spirit.
You work closely with the World Bank. I believe you were just with the head of the World Bank and other multilateral development banks. How do you perceive their pace of action and direction of travel since World Bank president and colleague of yours, Ajay Banga, took over? There are many critics in the climate community that want to see them move faster on climate in particular. I know you might have to be a little bit political here, but how do you perceive the broad pace of MDBs overall?
Well, look, I'm always one of the critics that wants everything to move faster because we're in an extraordinary climate crisis. If you look at over the past 20 years, the global infrastructure build out in terms of green energy, for example, less than 1% of all the green electrification that's been built across the planet is taking place in Africa. Less than 1%. And next year, there's going to be more coal than there was this year. This year, there's more coal than last year. Most of that coal is financed, 65% of it's in China. Most of it's financed by Chinese subsidized finance into developing and emerging economies. So big picture, we're losing the fight against climate change. And big picture, unless we transition developing and emerging economies, big and small, from fossil fuels to renewables, no matter what we do in other parts of the world, we simply do not win the fight against climate change. So to me, all these institutions have to do more. The leaders often want to, and I think Ajay at the bank is very committed to being aggressive. He's got, 17, 18 shareholders he has to deal with that are all the countries that negotiate every specific action. And that's why we have to make sure this Mission 300 project works. They committed $30 billion to one big project. We've brought a group of philanthropists, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Bezos Earth Fund, the IKEA Foundation, probably 24 other organizations to the task and said, let's make this a public-private endeavor. That 30 billion should unlock somewhere between 40 and 60 billion in private capital in order for that infrastructure bill to actually reach 300 million people. But I will tell you, I was in Nigeria in June. I met with a woman who, basically ran a small store that needed a refrigerator to keep drinks cold and things like that. And she said, look, I used to have a diesel generator. It cost me a ton of money to maintain and to get the fuel. I'd run it for a few hours a day. It was super unreliable. Now she has a solar battery system that we helped provide support for through a group called Sustainable Energy for All. And she's growing gangbusters. She put the refrigerators out in front of her storefront. Everybody wants a cold drink when it's 100 degrees out, and she's hiring people and expanding. And I went store by store by store to little agro processors that are, improving the quality of farm output. All of them are transforming their lives themselves through their own effort and ingenuity when they have access to power and electricity. And they're not going to get there with backup diesel generators in a world where that's just extremely expensive. So to me, yeah, everything should be moving faster, but the way to get there is to take a project like this and absolutely make it successful.
So notwithstanding the positive announcement that you guys made with your partners, do you perceive some sort of geopolitical holding of breath at the moment, not just for the U.S. election, but for other events that are happening around the world? It seems that's like, as the kids like to say, that's like the vibe right now, at UNGA seems to be that.
Holding your breath? Yeah. I think we've all been holding our breath for 5 years, and it's not just because of U.S. politics. So I wrote about this yesterday. If you look 10 years ago, because of the macroeconomic situation, there was $225 billion of public financial flows into developing and emerging economies. This year, there will be $50 billion of net flows out of those economies, mostly in the form of interest repayments on debt, to wealthy economies. So in that context, that's what, a $275 billion delta? In that context, taking on the single biggest investment challenge of our time, greening an economy for 3-4 billion people who live in these countries, is simply an unaffordable proposition in most places. So the net effect of that we have seen and we've been suffering through, which is pace on progress has been very, very slow. And then on top of that, I think everybody is absolutely holding their breath and saying, in every single election across this planet, is it going to be more populist withdrawal from global cooperation, or is it going to be understanding that actually we're safer and more secure and we're living on a planet that's habitable if we make these investments in a smart way abroad? And it's tough out there, as you know. So yeah, I think we're all holding our breath. This is a very, very difficult, disastrous macroeconomic environment for taking on this fight. It's why I keep coming back to, we just need these shining examples of success, not just little pilot projects, not one woman running one store in one suburb of Lagos, but an effort to reach 300 million people with the kind of resources that we can muster right now.
Taking that one step further, how do you see the global consequences of a second Trump term playing out? Just from chess pieces point of view.
Well, if you just look at what happened during the first term, where you saw just pulling out of Paris and then the knock-on effects of basically taking down participation in all of the kind of global climate engagements, that would be extremely disastrous now. It was really disastrous then, but it'll be extremely disastrous now. And the flip side also has to be true. It's like whoever wins, doing what we're doing now which is sort of piecing it together and living through an environment where those net resource flows have shifted so dramatically, as I described, from 225 billion to minus 50 billion. We need folks with creativity and innovation and plans to turn that around at scale. So it's not enough to say, hey, we're not pulling out of Paris. That's not going to achieve much. We actually got to drive real investment into the green economy in developing and emerging countries across this planet. And the only way we're going to do that is by scaling up IDA. This is basically how the World Bank gets funded. That's an opportunity to move real resources. By tapping into creative financial mechanisms, we helped create one called the Resilience and Sustainability Trust at the IMF. It's about $40 billion. That could be much, much, much larger with the right kind of political leadership. And working with partners in these countries to create what we call in the business local currency financing. But it's basically using our capacity to provide guarantees and first loss instruments so local pension funds and local banks can fund their own green transitions. If we do those things, and we do them at scale, and we do them with some courage, and we pay for them, then I can be optimistic. But if we, no matter who wins the election, if we just keep doing what we're doing now, it's not nearly enough.
Let alone go in the other direction.
Let alone going backwards.
Yeah. We like to end with one fun thing. You've been all over the globe during your career, especially as the head of USAID and now with Rockefeller. What's the one country or one city that you most enjoy going back to?
Most enjoy going back to? I didn't expect that. Gosh, there's so many amazing places. The place that I love going back to in particular is actually Cape Town in South Africa. I mean, South Africa in general is an amazing place. I first got to go there as a young student, just sort of seeing everything from the outside. Then I got to go once with President Obama and meet the extraordinary leadership there, including an effort earlier in my career where I had a chance to work with Nelson Mandela when he chaired something called the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization. And I got to see his leadership and then, in that same visit, see his jail cell. And then in that same visit, go to Cape Town and just experience the beauty of that place. So every time I go there, I think this is such an important microcosm of our whole world with beauty and struggle and challenge, and it changes my perspective, and so I just love continuing to go. By the way, South Africa hosts the G20 next year, which might sound super nerdy and is, but at the end of the day, unless the 20 countries that make up the G20 come together and offer the kind of leadership that was offered after World War II to deal with true global challenges like climate change, we simply won't be successful. So South Africa will have one more chance in the near future to stand up and rise up to its own reputation for what it's achieved in our imaginations.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but thanks for joining us at Axios House. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Please stick around and enjoy some refreshments and networking.
Thank you.